So, in terms of the impact that this would have, it would change in the beginning of the 20th century, whereby we would end up with mass internment being the order of the day. Now, mass internment wouldn't really work because in 1917 in the Feargal prison camp, it would merely last for a year and a half. But it would have a massive impact, and it would bring the beginning of what we know as Ghaeilge faoi ghlas, or the use of the Irish language as a means of struggle and solidarity during incarceration. So people would use the Irish language as a means to continue the struggle that they were carrying out on the outside, and this would have a very effect. During the Orange State, the prison ship Argenta, we had 6 or 7 graduates, as they were known, from Feargal, who were imprisoned after these arrests, teaching the Irish language, using the Irish language, and this would continue thereafter. The twilight years, as they were known, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, whereby people were incarcerated in term without trial, but with little public support on the outside, which is a difference which is worth making. But at the same time, they used the Irish language. They used the Shuil heart, as it was known. And we'll have a quote here from Liam Stewart, who I got just before he passed away, and he talked about the great teachers we had: Terry Wilson, Neil McGrattan, Moscow Jack Brady. They give me my golden fanya, which was smuggled in from the outside. This proved I was fluent, and I wore it to this day. This is a man who was in his 90s, who was talking about how that he still wore fanya that he had been given in the 40s. But this whole idea of the impact of the language could be used by Martin O'Kane here, who was in jail in the Curragh camp. He was a linguist, he talked about a whole bereft slum of raggy, hungry, fagless and turnees. None of them had been passed a national school, and they gobbled up the syllabic meters of Middle Irish, and I would face a concentration camp again to renew that experience. That was the impact of the language while they were actually incarcerated. So, in terms of the purposes of talk, I think we heard it last night when we were talking about the film Case 3. The cages and the hunger strike were different. The Orange State had decided to use internment again. Internment had worked in the 40s and the 50s when there was little public support. But in the 70s and in the early 70s, there was a mass revolt on the outside, and internment backfired. But the important thing about it was a campaign for status, the fact that prisoners had status, and the fact that in this jail, a batch of young people who I would use Gramsci's interpretation of the organic intellectual, who would disseminate, modify and inspire their peer group to learn the Irish language, were reading the works of Frantz Fanon, the works of Paulo Freire. They saw themselves in that anti-colonial context and were using that as motivation to learn the Irish language. And amongst them was Bobby Sands. They formed Cage 11, which would become a Gaeltacht hut, or a hut where the Irish language was used as the means of communication. And they would talk about Ghaeilge mas féidir, Bird mas ghlas, so Irish if possible, English if necessary. So they moved from as we said, as Freire talked about, the recipients to the subjects. And in this here, we'll have a quote here from Jim McCann, who talks about this ideological road. He talks about the fact that we knew the language was political. We knew imperialists had set out to destroy the language, and reasoned from that it must be important. It made, so for us, we had classes up to 13 hours a day. And when Jim McCann talked about it, was when I went into jail, I wasn't a Republican. Republicanism revealed itself to me while I was in prison, as I started to break down all the notions, all the reasons that had put me there. Again, this whole idea of ideological development and how this would move from formal education to people who would prepare for revival on the outside. People like Bobby Sands was playing a very central role at this time. He wrote a letter which was sent out to the Gaeltacht community on the outside of the Shaw's Road, praising them for what they had done and telling people that they could and should be part of it. Whereas people may have been sympathetic towards the Irish language revival, they may have given a pound if someone had rattled a tin in their face, didn't feel that they were part of it, they didn't feel that they could share in it, they didn't feel that they could have a self-confidence or self-esteem to be part of the Irish language revival. People like Bobby Sands was changing that. And one of the most important points that happened in terms of the move to the H blocks, as I talked about, was the fact that this cadre of prisoners would be re-imprisoned and bring with them this ideological development that they had developed in the cages. So a quote from Shana Welsh, who talks about the fact that 7 or 8 of us came to the prison with Irish in our lips. Within a year and a half, we had 300 people in freedom. So, very simple. In exceptional circumstances of repression, paradoxically, the Irish language would become a means of communication for hundreds of prisoners. And the reason being was they would teach classes, they would shout classes out the door of the cell. They may have heard last night in the film. They would use the miraculous madness to write the irregular verbs on the wall, and hundreds would use the Irish language. Now, it wasn't merely to use it for the sake of being hidden or to conceal what they're trying to say from the guards, as some people had made out, although that may have been an immediate compulsion. The main idea was this whole idea of culture and identity, and as one of the prisoners says when I had interviewed him, the idea of using the language as a weapon of struggle, using it as a weapon against the system, like we had used it on the outside. So we'll have Pater Whelan talking about every time we spoke Irish, we were telling our enemies we were Irish Republicans protesting and struggling. We weren't going to let them silence us. The most important thing was, what impact would this have? What impact would this immediate struggle have on the outside? And during the hunger strike period, this became quite acute because you had prisoners with Irish writing out to Irish language activists on the outside. We had a group called Ghaeilge Against Hate Blacks, which was formed. It was Irish language activists who were supporting the prisoners because they agreed with their fact demands, but they also agreed with the fact that they also knew the fact that they didn't speak in Irish and saw that there as a means to inspire them. So I'll actually have a column here which is quite historical. This is a column that was written by Ghaeilge. And what's interesting about this, it's in Irish. He's written out in Irish to none other than Moscow Jack Brady, who was incarcerated in the 40s, who got a mention there for giving somebody a gold fine in the 40s. He was writing out to him and asking him, could he use his influence with the Irish classes that he was taking to bring those Irish learners out in the streets to campaign on behalf of the two hunger strikers. Now, at this stage we're talking about March 1981, we're talking about Bobby Sands and Frank Hughes. He's asked them to come out to the streets and campaign on their behalf, and they asked the people of Andersonstown to carry banners with Irish language slogans. This is very, very important, and again, this is your impact we talked about earlier on, the ideology, the derived and the inherent. Something like that. I'll just show this. This is just on the outside. We'll have a hidden Ulster. As we said, there was a continuing Irish language revival taking place outside the prison walls. We had the Gaeltacht community. We had a small marginal Irish language revival, but was still very, very important nonetheless, because it planted the seed. And this crowd of working class activists bought their own land, built their own homes, had a cooperative, whereas they raised their kids with Irish. And these people would meet with these Irish language activists who Bobby Sands was sending out of the prison. The hundreds of people who were coming out to join the Irish language revival, and they would follow the slogan of the Shaw's Road Gaeltacht, which was Na Habaré Johnny. So Republican prisoners would play a central role in forming a D school in Ardoyne, founding a primary school in Shortstown, a primary school in Twinbrook, schools in Uri, in Derry, and so on. So there would be a massive revival after this, and their families and their kids and their wider families would also feel that they could be part of this. So, just in conclusion, I would argue that the Freudian project of conscientiation is key here, that these prisoners reach critical consciousness and they can re-signify and recast resistance in order to inspire those beyond the prison walls. And this idea of the inherent and the derived coming together, and the ground being laid by the Shaw's Road Gaeltacht to be effectively absorbed by the ideology of radical decolonisation that would stem from the efforts of these people, these Republican prisoners who were learning Irish while they were incarcerated. And we have campaigns for language rights. All the regenerative cultural projects are based upon this ideology of decolonisation that stemmed from during this period. So they're bottom up, and they would promote transformational activism where social beings can become agents of change. And just to sum up, I have a quote here from Tway Smith, who's a Maori activist, and she talks about the fact that these small stories, these small elements of our history can have a very, very important role. And she talks about the past, our story. So in this case, the story of Ankeshada, the story of these Republican prisoners, both local and both global, present our communities, our cultures, our languages, our practices. All could be spaces of marginalisation, but have to be seen as spaces of resistance and hope.